comes from the first chapter of the book of Mark. We'll be reading verses 29 through 34 and then verses 40 through 45. Mark chapter 1, starting at verse 29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. A leper came to him, begging him, kneeling. He said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So we are in this series called Another Way of Seeing. I know you wonder, when are we going to be finished with this series? There are just a few more topics that need to be covered, that we need to think about together as we form our identity, who we are, what we stand for, and then what we have to offer as we move forward to serve as God would have us do that. We're working on that in terms of our vision statement as well. Part of that is trying to understand who we are as a community of faith, and then what it is that we're called to do here in this community. So we come this morning, and the topic is the Bible. The Bible. Viewpoints on the Bible have created tremendous disagreement and division among Christians for a long, long time. Throughout history, really. It's an important topic with tremendous passion attached to it. So the topic may take more than 1 week to cover. I apologize for that. But as I was thinking through it, we may need a couple of weeks to do this well. I'm going to begin this morning with a macro observation on the Bible. Big picture. And then as we move forward, we'll get maybe a little more specific. So the first thing I want to say about the Bible this morning, and really the only thing I want to say about the Bible this morning, is this. The Bible is God's holy word communicated through story. Story. It's not an outline. It's not a life manual. It's not a book of propositions or principles set out in nice, tidy categories or lists that we just refer to when we have a problem and need the answer. It is first and foremost a story. A messy, winding, sometimes confusing, occasionally contradictory, often fascinating and enlightening story about real life and real people and the world, set in ancient times and various cultures. Mostly it's a story, and mostly it's a God story. When we forget that, we can go sideways in all sorts of interesting ways. So as we begin this conversation today, I'm going to tell you a story. So for the past several months, Jesus had been collecting students, followers. He'd moved to Capernaum recently. He was recently baptized by John in the River Jordan and moved to Capernaum and met some fishermen two sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew and James and John. They were actually business partners. And they were fishing by the sea one day, and Jesus invited them to be his students. He was a rabbi. And so they started meeting together. They would go every Saturday to the synagogue together. And after the synagogue service, they would often, sometimes Jesus would even speak in these services. And after the service, they would go over to Peter and Andrew's house for a little nosh. Do you know the word nosh? Do you know what nosh? Nosh is kind of somewhere in between a snack and lunch. It's just, half a bagel, some cream cheese, a little fish, just something to eat while you're talking together. Sometimes they would sit around and maybe talk about the sermon or evaluate what was said, agreeing or disagreeing, their various points of view. And in the end, might begin to play some games, or maybe they'd take a nap. Jesus was getting to know them. They were becoming friends. On this particular day, as they went to Simon's and Andrew's house, Simon's wife met them at the door and pulled Simon off to the side and said, "Simon, can we call off the lunch for today? My mom is in bed. Her fever took a turn for the worst, and I don't know if she's going to make it." And with that, she begins to cry a little bit. And so Peter turns to the group of his friends, and he says, "Look, can we cancel today? Can we postpone? My wife's mom is really not feeling well, and we're not sure what's going to happen." Well, Jesus had known Simon's mother-in-law quite well, and asks kind of a shocking question. He asks whether or not he can go see her. And Peter says, fine. I mean, people didn't usually go hang out with people who were sick because of the possibility of getting sick themselves. So Jesus goes in there. Nobody else went with him. He just went in there by himself. And after a few moments, here comes Jesus walking outside, being followed by Simon's mother-in-law right behind. They're both grinning from ear to ear. Everybody is in stunned silence and shock. And Jesus sort of just looks at everyone and says, "Let's eat." Well, nobody was there. Nobody saw what was going on except one of Peter's nieces, Miriam. Miriam was at the doorway seeing what had happened. And so Miriam, 10 years old, runs home to tell her mom and tells her what had happened, how Jesus reached down, touched her, and as soon as he did, the fever left her, and she sat up as alert as ever. And Miriam's mom looked out the window, and sure enough, there was Simon's mother-in-law talking and milling around everyone. They were all very excited. So she walks next door to tell Mrs. Bernstein, adding one or two details along the way, as often happens. And Mrs. Bernstein was astonished. She goes next door to the Levines, and Mrs. Levine goes over to Mrs. Schoenberg, and pretty soon this word begins to spread all over the town that Jesus, this rabbi from Nazareth, had raised up Simon's mother-in-law. They were shocked with just a touch. The whole city had heard the news to such an extent that at sundown, as soon as Sabbath was over and people could actually get out of their houses, hundreds of people began to gather at Simon's house. They brought their sick, and it's like the whole city showed up. And Jesus saw them coming and begins to move through them, healing the sick, touching them, speaking to them. The whole city shows up, except for one. One member of the city wasn't there, but he was close. He was up on the hill looking in. He couldn't come into the city because he was a leper. Lepers weren't allowed into the city. But that night he looked in, and what he saw was amazing. Leprosy was a greatly feared disease. incurable, attacking the body through the skin, eating away body cells, destroying nerves. It was thought to be highly contagious, so when someone got leprosy or contacted leprosy, they had to move away and move out into the unpopulated areas. It was 12 years ago now. 12 years ago when he had first recognized that he had this awful disease. He can hardly even remember now when he was healthy. He had been struggling to remember what his only daughter even looked like. She was so young when all this happened. He can still remember the day when his wife saw that tiny spot on his cheek, and then it began to spread. Eventually he went to see the priest in town, and they confirmed, yes, he had leprosy, and within the hour they ushered him out of the city, and he had to go live among other lepers. He and his family stayed in contact for a while. They made an agreement to meet out in the wilderness and to stay apart, but to talk. And he'd catch up on the news and what was going on in the city and what was going on with them. His daughter was only 4 years old at the time and couldn't understand why he couldn't come home. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" she would ask. "I don't know, honey, soon, I hope." He didn't want her to worry. And then he would always tell her a joke to kind of make her laugh. After about a year, it became very clear to him, after these daily meetings, that his wife and daughter needed to go on with their lives without him. Their lives had all but stopped since this had happened. And those meetings were way too painful for everyone. He knew nothing would ever change. He decided to tell them that it was way too difficult for him to come all this way and too dangerous for them to travel out on their own, so he wouldn't be coming anymore to meet them. His wife saw right through him and protested the action, but he was firm. He felt it was the last loving thing he felt he could do for them. He still came to the spot every day, however, but he stayed hidden behind some rocks. For weeks, his wife and daughter continued to come every day and wait for a long time, hoping he would show up, but he didn't. He stayed hidden and watched them. They started missing a few days now and then, and before long his wife only came out by herself once a week. She would sit on a rock and stare out in the distance and cry, and sometimes for hours. From his hiding place, he would cry too, long after she stopped crying and returned to the city. For the last couple of years, she only came out to this spot on their wedding anniversary. How badly he wanted to run out to her, but he knew it would only start the daily pain for her all over again. And then it was last year on their anniversary. She didn't come. He spent the night out there in the cold, wishing he were dead. What good is this life anyway? What a waste. Why did this have to happen to me? What did I do? What went wrong? Now he would come to the city only occasionally just to look in on it, trying to catch a glimpse of his wife or daughter, but usually it was so late that everybody was indoors. But as he approached the ridge tonight, on this night, the city is unusually loud and wild. People are running everywhere. It looked chaotic. People were yelling and screaming, jumping and dancing in the streets. People were carrying their crutches and pallets, shouting, "I'm healed, I can walk, I can see, I can hear." Never seen anything like it. He could hardly contain himself from rushing right into the center of town to see what was going on, to see if maybe he could be healed too. But it was against the law for him to enter. And what if leprosy was the only thing that couldn't be healed? A few days later, he discovered from some travelers that the healer was Jesus, the rabbi from Nazareth. And he was determined to find him. Not too many days later, Jesus was returning to Capernaum after speaking at some of the neighboring villages in the north with a whole group of his followers with him. The leper saw this as his chance. So he sprung up from behind some trees He jumped up from his hiding place and ran as fast as he could toward Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, "Unclean, unclean," as was the law when you approached people. Sure enough, the entire group, as soon as they saw the leper coming toward them, they scampered back down the hill and off the road. Finally, several hundred feet away, they turned around and realized and were surprised to see that Jesus hadn't moved. They saw the leper kneeling before him from a distance. And then their surprise turned to horror as they watched Jesus reach out and touch him. "He's crazy," a couple of them mumbled to themselves. "Has he lost his mind? He's touching a leper." Up the hill, the leper is kneeling before Jesus, saying, "Jesus, if you want to, I know you can make me clean. I watched you heal hundreds the other night. I wanted to run into the city, but I couldn't because of this ugly disease. Can you heal me?" Jesus was moved with compassion for him and the pain that he saw in his face, a much deeper pain than his illness. And he reached down and pulled the leper to his feet, embraced him with both arms, and even that leper was surprised by this. It had been 12 years since anyone dared touch him, and the isolation was as excruciating as the open sores. The leper began to weep. Years of pain and suffering break out in gushes and sobs, and Jesus weeps with him. And through their tears, he whispers, "I am willing, be clean." The leper didn't hear him because of the noise of his own sobs, but all of a sudden he realized something that he hadn't realized or felt in years. He realized that he could feel Jesus' hands, and he could feel his touch, and he could feel his arms around him. He stepped back and looked at his hands. The leprosy was no longer there. His flesh had been restored. He was clean. He was trembling with shock, staring in disbelief. Jesus says to him, "Go now, show yourself to the priest, and they'll let you go home. But don't tell anyone how this happened to you. I'm already under suspicion by the Pharisees, and they don't need to hear that I hugged a leper today." But the leper was hardly listening. He was too excited. He grabbed Jesus, thanked him over and over and over, then took off running toward Capernaum faster than he'd ever run in his life, straight to the priest, straight to his family, and told everyone he met what Jesus had done for him. And Mark concludes the story in this way, verse 45. "But he went out and began to proclaim it freely, to spread the news about, to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere." The beginning of Jesus' sacrifice. Willingly he took the leper's place outside the city walls so the leper could go home again. When we pay attention to stories, when we pay attention to the Bible as a story, we enter it, not just analyzing it with our brains, but we enter it and connect with it with our lives. Because who doesn't know what this leper felt like? Who doesn't know what it feels like to not fit in? Who doesn't know what it feels like to not measure up? Who doesn't know what it means to feel like we're all alone? We all know what that feels like. We all know what it feels like to be a misfit. But then we see Jesus coming towards us as he comes toward this leper. We feel him wrap his arms around us too, not believing it at first, not being able to actually accept it at first. Doesn't seem possible. And the key of the whole story to me, now we could have a discussion here this morning, and we could talk about what parts of this story do you connect with? Or maybe there's some things in the story that you see that I didn't even bring out into the open. The point is, when we reduce the Bible to principles, and we reduce it to propositions, and we reduce it to a list of rules or an outline, it loses its power to engage us. And the story of the Bible was meant to draw us in, to engage us, and to realize that our stories are just like these stories. Our lives are just like these lives. Our lives are God's stories, just as these stories are God's stories. The Bible is meant, these stories are meant to draw you in, to ask questions. Not for me to give you all the answers, but for you to ask these questions. What's going on here? What is this about? What does this mean? What does this say to me? Because my life, just as the Bible, my life is a story, is a God story. In that something is happening. God is present among us, in us, around us. There's something going on. You, if born in a different time, could have been in the Bible. Your story. And the whole way of being able to understand our stories is to be able to reflect these stories we read in the Scripture for ourselves. Our own stories are messy and uncertain and full of contradictory experiences, right? It's our own story. Our stories aren't neat and tidy, are they? Anybody here have a neat and tidy life where everything makes sense and everything's in its place and life is a mess? God is the God of messes. God works in messes. Proclaims his good news. Don't ever shortchange the story of the Bible. Don't let anybody take the story and hand you a rule, or take the story and hand you a principle. Story ignites our imaginations, and imagination is the bedrock of faith. Don't shortchange the story. Stories are really the heartbeat of the Bible. When we forget that, we get all messed up in our various arguments and ways of seeing it. The story of the Bible, it's meant to bring us home. It's the story of the miracle of God's pursuit. He's pursuing us because of his love for us. He's reaching to us as he reaches to this leper. The miracle of this story is that the leper let himself be touched, let himself be hugged. After years of feeling shamed and out apart from the community of mankind, he allowed Jesus trusted Jesus enough to let him hug him. Somehow it's through that embrace that Jesus works his miracle of healing within. His salvation miracle that puts us back together again. Makes us whole. That's our hope. That's our salvation story. That God is a lover and he pursues those he loves with an energy and a resilience, and won't quit until he has you in his arms to let you know that you are his beloved. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.